This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
So just for a minute, I'm possibly made the mistake of wanting to show you some video with sound. And then I'm just trying to get it to work out the speaker so you can hear it. So bear with me a moment. It's a Mr. Bean cartoon, so I'm using it to test things. Sounds weird. Alright, we'll see how we go with the video.
Easy. The war effort had exhausted a lot of the necessary materials. Much of them had to be imported, and there were long delays. To make the most of what was available...
Okay, you can hear that. Good afternoon. How are you all? Thanks for coming back, week 2. Great to see you all here. And hi to everybody listening at home as well. Or listening later. If you're here and listening later, I'm saying hi to you in the future as well. Hope you all enjoyed the readings this week. A bit of reading in them. They weren't too long, but there's quite a lot of concepts kind of in them that I'll be kind of touching on as we go through this week. I'm going to do my best to kind of keep with the narratives and keep with the examples so that things are hopefully kind of in digestible kind of chunks to kind of understand. I'm not going to throw a lot of graphs and charts and stats at you. If you think I'm not throwing enough graphs and charts and stats at you, you can feed that back to the tutors. But to be honest, in a learning environment where you're kind of sitting passively watching, listening to me and watching slides, I find that stats and charts, etc., often aren't actually the most effective learning tool kind of in this environment. They're usually best kind of looked at and grappled at probably on a one-to-one basis when you're doing your readings, when you're going over things, when you're doing your assignments. But that's my particular idea about kind of how to approach these kind of learning environments. But and I'm also drawing on looking at comparing with previous years. Like I look at the work that, and some of the work I'm drawing on this week is because my predecessor last year, Dr. Hmpp, who's now in Toronto, is kind of a very kind of skilled kind of economist and very good with numbers. So I'm looking at some of the things he'd done in week 2 last year, and I went, okay, how did that go down? Do people really kind of grab onto that? He's a very funny and great lecturer, so I think maybe that probably helped. But I'm kind of staying a little bit away from that approach and trying to talk a little bit more about the concepts through solid examples and just to see how things kind of are settling with you. And you please use your tutorials as a channel of kind of feedback as how things are kind of working, how you feel the concepts, the ideas, the learning the different parts of what we're trying to grapple with over 12 weeks is kind of settling with you. Because I'm, as I said last week, I'm very open to getting your kind of wisdom kind of back on how well it's working. So this week, key concepts about land ownership and tenure in Australia. Yeah, I'll touch on a bit of that. A lot more about ownership. We'll talk about tenure. Well, there's different types of tenure. I'm not going to be talking about rental a whole lot at the moment. We'll be kind of covering that as we kind of go through. Finance and governance. Yeah, going to be having a look at that. And housing as part of the Australian economy. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not comfortable with the term Australian economy. I'll probably have a bit of rant. Beginning of next week, I might have a bit of rant about language that's used to talk about housing and public policy in this space, in urban space. And the word economy is one of those that it's like, what? Economy, it's like a thing? It's like the market? It's not. There's lots of different markets. They don't think. They're not entities. They're not people. They don't have feelings. So the Australian economy, you know, I don't think it's useful for us people working in urban spaces to be kind of thinking about these things as kind of chunks of kind of solid entities like the economy or the market, because it means we're not thinking with kind of recognition of complexity. And I guess what I'm going to be emphasizing right throughout this subject is really get into complexity and feel uncomfortable with it and feel like you don't really understand most of the time, because that's the nature of complexity and that's the nature of the kind of modern world that we live in. You're trying to learn the parts as you go to try to make the best sense of what you have. So, small rant, I'll go on. All right, so that's the structure for today. In kind of 4 parts today. We'll see how we go. I love David Graeber. I don't know if any of you have read him. His most recent book has been quite successful, called Bullshit Jobs. But I think he's a great thinker, especially because he's an anthropologist, and they don't often get much of a Guernsey really in terms of kind of big intellectual kind of thinkers in the modern world. But he's got a lot to say, and he's written a lot about systems, and he's written a lot about the kind of structure of kind of the kind of late capitalism that we kind of live in. And I thought that was, hopefully it will emerge why this quote was kind of suitable for today in terms of talking about debt and finance. Right. So I ended last week with this. I'm going to go back to it, and we'll probably be talking a bit more about it next week as well, because one of the, I guess, key kind of authors kind of using this kind of concept, Terry Burke, is going to be with us next week. And though he's going to be talking about economics, he's, I think, got a very kind of good kind of, he's got lots of examples to kind of support kind of why this model is useful. What I want to do is just, in the first section today, is just kind of briefly go through the four elements of the housing system so that they, I guess, start to kind of hopefully sit kind of well with you. And if it does prompt any questions, or even if I decide to throw out a question, please feel free to answer. But it's something for your tutorials as well to kind of look at in terms of getting a handle around this system. All right. So the first one, production. There is a very, I'm not sure if it's unique, but it's very specific to Australia in relation to the kind of this area, land ownership, land assembly, and housing production. And that is this often very big division in the kind of the production of housing and the production of kind of built form between those who own the land and those who actually build on the land. And in housing, it's particularly stark. We've got and that has kind of all kinds of implications, as we'll see as we kind of go through the subject, in terms of policy and in terms of what we'll touch on a bit today, kind of policy capture or the kind of influence or power in terms of that. So there's many other countries where, and I guess in this space you often get UK and US examples, but in the UK, many of the housing developers are significant kind of landowners. They buy the land, they develop the land, and that's a significant part of their kind of model. It's interesting how that kind of plays out in kind of the built form, because I'm not sure how many of you spent much time in the UK and in Ireland where it's similar, but there's these things called housing estates. Now, housing estate in Australian context is usually thought of as, it's probably public housing, it's probably, medium or high-rise kind of tower blocks. But housing estates are actually usually areas where maybe a maximum 3 types of house, but often just 1 or 2 types of house, basically are replicated over hectares and hectares. It's a very efficient kind of, I guess, Henry Ford kind of approach to kind of production. Because what you're doing is you're actually you've got immense economies of scale when you're building exactly the same thing in exactly the same space in a limited period of time. If we're looking at growth areas in Australia, that's not the way things work in growth areas in Australia. It's the division between land, people get sold house and land packages, and those of you doing property are very familiar with this, but a house and land package is still house and land. There's still a very big kind of separation there, and that has all kinds of implications for pricing and for efficiency of market players. Similarly, in inner kind of areas. The development of land is done by mostly small to medium-sized players. I recently was involved in doing some work at my kind of main job at Moreland Council, looking at housing supply. And I thought, well, we want to kind of talk to the developers about what they think about housing supply. And I kind of, in my head, it was, okay, we'll talk to the big ones, the medium ones, and some of the small ones, you know, the ones that do the all those lovely townhouse developments. That looks so nice. And I found out even in a place like Moreland, in a city kind of area like Moreland, it's got a suburb like Brunswick, where there's been significant, and continuing to be significant apartment growth in that area. We actually don't have any of the big Australian developers operating in the whole municipality. You know, only the medium size, and you know, so, and that has big, you know, that has big implications. So when you're thinking about, there's a lot of discussion in housing about developers, a lot of discussion in planning about developers, et cetera, developers. Often developers are one part of the picture. It's very important to think about landowners. Who's owning the land and what are they doing with it? And what decisions they're making. Because they're often quite separate kind of threads of activity going on in the Australian market. What's next? I keep pressing the wrong button. Consumption. We're going through examples of kind of this today about consumption. It is the dominant kind of discussion in kind of housing kind of policy and housing kind of in the media talking about housing in the debate is about consumption in terms of home ownership. And that makes a lot of sense in Australia. Australia, as I mentioned, I think last week reached kind of 70% kind of home ownership kind of rate in the mid-60s. But it's actually only recently, it's actually only into this century that we're beginning to see that beginning to kind of actually drop off, beginning to be kind of in a steady kind of drop off compared to those who rent. So the other thing to think about with consumption is, in terms of housing policy, is consumption for what? For who? Is it consumption for, is it housing for housing ownership? Is it housing for investment? Which is then consumed through a rental product. See, and there's another kind of layer there. So in terms of production of housing, should be thinking about, you know, there is a very significant kind of impact of producing the type of housing that will be largely financed or bought by those who want to then rent it out, what they call investors, compared to those who plan to actually live in the property, or the product being kind of designed for those who are kind of owner-occupiers. The other thing about consumption in Australia is that we have, Victoria's got like the lowest percentage of social housing in the OECD. Yay for us. What a proud stat that is. We don't have overall in Australia, I might be wrong, you can correct me on it, I think it's 4.6% social housing in Australia. So Victoria's pretty low and getting lower compared to population. So that means that the market housing, private development is absolutely dominant. It's the dominant kind of paradigm in talking about housing production. Now we'll be hearing and talking a lot about whether that should be so, and you know, whether what you do about affordability, what you do about, this week is National Homelessness Week, and I'm sure you've been seeing a lot of media about, the massive kind of gap in social housing and housing for people who are homeless, at the risk of homelessness, on very low income, etc. But also the affordability issue that goes right through the kind of income levels and people in different situations. And the question of whether where that provision comes from, whether there is a primer to actually to allow more consumption of kind of social housing in this country. There's been there are certainly policies there to kind of encourage more social housing, but in Victoria, as we'll kind of discuss as we go through, we haven't seen much of it come through yet. So largely when we're talking about consumption, we're talking about privately produced housing, and it's either privately rented, it's owned usually through the provision of a mortgage. What should we be talking about? Just one more. Exchange. This is one I'll focus on a bit this week in terms of finance, but I also want you to think about the actual, and I will kind of come up with a few examples of it. I really welcome your thoughts, especially because I know you're doing the Masters of Property, so probably know more about some areas than me, like the real estate space. But I think when we're talking about exchange in this space, it's easy to kind of just say, okay, that's about banks and financial institutions and where the money comes from, to produce the material. So we can talk about that. And there's very important things to understand about the kind of financing of the production of housing, especially in terms of the different models of development. The speculative model of development for medium to high density housing, especially high density housing, is really completely different to the financing kind of standalone kind of houses or small to medium density houses, especially in outer suburbs. So that's a very important kind of distinction. There's also much to consider in terms of what's happening with the kind of financial services, kind of, especially in light of recent events. I'll talk about that later. The other thing to think about, though, in exchange is the real estate industry. It's very, very important. It's almost so pervasive that you kind of forget to see it, or you stop seeing it sometimes, how pervasive the real estate, kind of the operation of the real estate sector is in terms of kind of housing provision. And so I'm very interested, and again, something you can bring to your tutorials as well, interested in the operation of, the governance of, the cultural values kind of around kind of the real estate kind of sector in Australia, and what that means for the provision of housing. Because I think I think it is quite significant and probably seriously under-researched. I mean, there's not a lot of stuff about it. There's one, I think the reading next week which looks at some of the psychology around housing, looks at the Edinburgh examples, when you see the Christie reading, is a good kind of rare example that starts to think about kind of what is actually happening between the relationship between consumers of housing and the real estate process. But it's one to really kind of think about for your assignments, the first and second one as well. So it's often it's kind of not discussed, just accepted, but I kind of look at it, you know, and kind of go, I think there's a lot to understand there, and there's a lot to maybe even to kind of challenge your kind of assumptions about why it is how it is. For instance, the public auction system in Victoria, unique in the world. That in itself is, you know, very, often really quite problematic in terms of what it does to kind of pricing. And management. We're going to touch on a little bit of this today, and we're going to be talking a lot about government kind of all the way through, and I think a lot of the readings will reflect this. There's a bit of a double think about housing markets in a place like Australia and a lot of kind of late capitalist kind of Western kind of countries, is that especially the kind of, you know, your, dare I say, your kind of English-speaking nations would tend to be kind of dominate the kind of the thinking, and, you know, within institutions like this, where it's market, and, you know, basically government's role, and hello neoliberalism the last 40 years, government's role is to actually smooth and make the market efficient for housing, because it's the market delivers housing. Private interests deliver housing. Well, I guess as we go through, I want to kind of be pointing out as we kind of go through every part of the housing system, the government's in there everywhere, in so many different places. And that's why government kind of policy, that's why the law matters, government policy decision matters, government's resource decisions matter in relation to housing. And certainly that's something that you can see in probably both the Birkenholz and Hmpp's reading this week, them kind of, you know, in different ways talking about that and kind of challenging the idea that you know, government is there just as a facilitator. Government plays an active role, and when government plays an active role, I guess coming from my particular kind of, I guess, framing, I will immediately ask the question, all right, who's it working for? You know, because I think we're naive when we start with an assumption that government gets involved with the common good. That's not really how it works very often. So you've got to ask questions then, in the housing space, who's government working for? Are there parts of the governance system where the management of housing, where it is technocratic, it is efficient, it is kind of promoting kind of, you know, symmetric information exchange? Or are there other parts where it is about, you know, there are certain kind of embedded kind of interests that are kind of reinforced or supported or exalted by government policy? So, as I say, this will come up as a theme right the way through. Press the wrong button again. So, that's our simplistic little model, which we'll kind of keep coming back to, but I do encourage you, especially in assignment 1, to look at it possibly as a useful way to kind of, I'm not saying do assignment 1 based on these checkbox 4 different areas, how it relates to a housing narrative, but you might find it useful as a way to kind of navigate through the different kind of ways of looking at kind of the housing system, and then how it impacts on actual people like yourself and your family and things that you know. Before I kind of move on from there and possibly play some videos and hopefully they'll work, any kind of questions kind of about this framing, about does it generally make sense what's in? Does it seem to kind of cover everything, or is it missing anything?
socioeconomic demographic of those who are purchasing for home ownership or investing to yield a rental product. How does that get captured in consumption? Like, what influence does it play? Like, for example, and this is probably me being very crass, the reality is that if you look at who's in Parliament, they're all around the baby boomer age, and the highest population demographic is around the baby boomer age and up, so you're not really going to alienate that voter base and create a policy that basically taxes and shortchanges that demographic to support, say, my demographic as an elder millennial.
Yeah.
So where does that sit? Is it management, product, like, are there just touch points throughout the whole thing, or?
I think I would say think about this model it's a model about what happens. It's not a model about what should happen or what does, how things should be. It's a way of actually looking at the system and actually then interrogating, then maybe, is this the best way? Does this deliver outcomes here, there, and everywhere? What if this part of the system was changed? So that's what I say. So look at this when you're describing a system, you're describing a complex system with kind of moving parts, but its values are within its individual parts. So I think in kind of looking at it and kind of, if you're asking the question, which is also asked in, I guess, against both the readings this week and asked a lot, why won't kind of, where is the incentive, where's the drive for those of a particular age and class in this country to actually support policy changes which would actually may hurt their kind of hip pocket or their kind of wealth, then, I guess what I encourage you to do is see, well, where is that? So how much does, if you're talking about negative gearing doesn't kind of sit in one of those, the negative gearing policy question, the question of should negative gearing continue, should it be dumped, should it be tinkered with a bit, like Labour at one point suggested they do with the government, but now they've jumped that completely and decided they won't, but they were going to, where does that sit? Well, it really sits in different kind of parts of the system. Obviously in management, it sits in terms of it's a policy direction, it's fiscal policy based at the federal level of government. On the consumption question, obviously it comes down to actually, the choices and the ability people have to kind of actually consume kind of housing. Questions about, which is always the big question in the negative gearing debate, about whether it will act as have a chilling effect on the actual production of new housing or not, et cetera, et cetera. And then in terms of the kind of exchange system, again, you're talking about how much let's say, for instance, go back to the real estate sector. How much is the kind of business model of the local, kind of your local real estate sector based on not just the turnover of kind of housing, new and existing housing, but the relationship to rentals? Then how would that be affected? So is that a long-winded answer to how to kind of approach it?
I think it captures it really well, what you said about it being kind of a checklist, if you will, of how you challenge certain things and ideas and the touch points that you have to consider when you're kind of building an argument or against whatever idea you've got.
Yeah, that's one way to do it. Yeah, let's check it out. I certainly found it helpful when I discovered it. So I was like, okay, I can I think I find understanding housing systems easier once I've kind of looked at this model. So, you know, I'm thankful to Professor Burke for that, and it'll be great to see him next week. All right, let's move on. Now, let's see how the sound goes here. I want to play a couple of videos. I think it's loud enough. I'm not sure it's coming through the speakers, but I think this is pretty loud, so hopefully it's kind of going to work. But I apologize if this is a little clunky, and if ads come up, you know.
The war effort had exhausted a lot of the necessary materials. Much of them had to be imported, and there were long delays.
Okay, let's stop there. You know, whenever I'm ever at an event and there's technical issues with the AV stuff.
The war effort had exhausted a lot of the necessary and had to be imported, and there were long delays.
I always say to myself, well, I'm never going to do that. All my AV stuff is going to be really efficient. Give me one moment.
Easy. The war effort had exhausted a lot of the necessary. Much of them had to be imported, and there were long delays. To make the most of what was available, house sizes were restricted to 12 squares, about 10 metres by 10 metres. And the shortage of tradesmen meant that about half of the new homes were built by their owners.
This is the book we kept.
All right, I'm going to go at it another way. Bear with me a moment. I was hoping to get in here early today to have all this running, but there's another subject that runs right up to the start of this. All right.
Easy. The war effort had exhausted a lot of the necessary materials. Much of them had to be imported, and there were long delays.
You hear that,
to make
Rob?
the most of what was available, house sizes were restricted to 12 squares, about 10 metres by 10 metres. And the shortage of tradesmen meant that about half of the new homes were built by their owners.
This is the book we kept with the expenses in.
Yes. It starts off with land £159, a stainless steel sink, $13.73. Hardware, our refrigerator, that was a big expense, that was £60. That was a lot then, wasn't it?
Yes. Third of the price of the land.
The house all up cost us about £2,000.
£2,000 was roughly 3 times what Roger earned in a year.
I've been a saver, and so has Olive. I said was with Olive. And she'd saved £1,000, and I'd saved 1,000, but we were a little bit short, and I had to go to the bank and borrow £200, and to me it seemed a very large amount, and I was really worried, wasn't I, Olive?
Well, it was a large amount of money. We were
But-
worried about paying it back.
But that's the only money I've ever borrowed. So I think we, got off pretty well.
Within 10 years of the war ending, 300,000 new houses had been built. As dream homes, they were fairly simple. Most were freestanding houses on a quarter-acre block, about 1,000 square metres. Big enough for the house, a garden, a vegetable patch, and a place for the kids to play. Inside were newly available appliances to make Mum and Dad's life easier, and a spirit of optimism that seemed universal.
The future of this or any nation is bound up in the dignity of its family life. Here is the very core of our well-being, the foundation for the years of vast development which are to come. A sturdy roof to live under, a patch of ground, trees, and the fresh, clean wind. There is much to be done before every family can enjoy a home of their own. For that is their birthright.
Home of their own is their birthright. Don't you love it? And as we'll be kind of hearing throughout the subject, that idea of kind of housing as a right, housing as a human right, the idea of kind of housing as a minimal kind of provision has, I think, become kind of louder and louder in kind of discourse, especially in a number of kind of nations across the world, and we'll be kind of talking about that rather than talking about, you know, everything about the market. But I wanted to, I guess, skip forward to 2018. It'll be good if it copied.
Let's suppose that you're...
Alright, let's bring up an ad. Next time I play a video, it's not going to be this dumb. My apologies. I'll stop it before it gets kind of controversial, because apparently some people got quite upset about this. Has anybody not seen this? Is any of this okay? It went a little bit viral in social media. So 14 Chamberlain Road, Padstow. Padstow's, I don't know, who's from Sydney? Tell me equivalent suburb in Melbourne for Padstow. Broadmeadows, maybe? Something like that? It's not a, it's a low kind of, low income area with a lot of kind of post-war, pretty simple kind of housing. And the real estate agent decided that they'd do a very kind of raunchy video to promote it. And within kind of about 24 hours, they were apologizing for it, because people said it was disgraceful, that people should be doing dirty dancing, kind of in a real estate video. I think about 24 hours later, they put it up again because everybody loved it and thought it was hilarious. What interests kind of me about it is the kind of the detail. The house had been bought 2 years before for about half the price. The price it was being put on the market for was about $1.5 million. And it had kind of looked like that 2 years before. So here's the these are these gorgeous homes we saw in the previous video with all the perfect kind of family and the perfect life, getting, you know, living the Australian dream. And I think the ads kind of suggest that things have kind of changed, but I'm just wondering how they've changed. Has it changed in terms of general kind of levels of affluence in the country and kind of what people can kind of afford? Or is this how much of this is this a cultural change? Or is this something about kind of what the market kind of, you know, makes available and kind of says, this is what you want, people? And the place did sell, I think, for more than the asking price to a 23-year-old young person. Where they got the money from. So just an example of thinking about built form, thinking about when we're talking about housing, we're also talking about kind of what's happening with infill as well, whether it's replacing single housing or actually putting density onto kind of lovely little places like this. That's a significant part of the housing production market. There's a lot of work for demolition companies these days out in the suburbs. You'll go on any suburban street and you will see either a house about to be demolished, in process of being demolished. Hi, you here for the housing market subject? Yeah. Cool. Come in. So let's give that an example. Briefly, I'm a bit late today. Okay. Just wanted to give you a brief example, just in terms of this real estate place. It's a real example because this was something that myself and my wife kind of looked at recently and went through a kind of process of actually nearly purchased. Well, I'll tell you why we didn't. So this is a unit and a small block, and in just off Sydney Road. Price is pretty good for Coburg. If anybody doesn't know, kind of the Coburg market's just been insane for the past 7 or 8 years. Coburg used to be a very down at heel kind of suburb. Now it's trendy. But this seemed like good value. And the question we asked was, it seemed like very good value. Like, look at all that outdoor space. Looks lovely. You got a like front courtyard, you got car space, of course, very important. Everybody needs car space. You got this little thing here. And you got this outdoor decking. And then we read the section 32. And here's where, and we're talking about kind of housing and kind of governance, consumer rights, information provision, whatever. This is a specific kind of important kind of document in the kind of process of house ownership in this country. Now, I don't know if any or all of you are familiar with the section 32. I'm not sure how many of you have gone through the home ownership process. I'll be totally honest with you. My advanced years, I recently didn't buy this place, but this is the first time I bought a home in my whole life, after living in 42 different places as an adult. So I was very keen to learn everything about the process. But mostly kind of what I kind of learned is how much I was impressed by the amount of information that seemed to be available, supported by different acts, mostly state acts in terms of information. But then there's the other side of it in terms of like whether you can, whether that everybody will be kind of really savvy enough to actually understand that information. So things like in section 32, you can see here, you can find out, well, you know who owns it, but you know who's got an interest in the property. And if there's other caveats in the property, and sometimes there may be, if there's planning, you get all the planning kind of reports, et cetera, et cetera. Section 32 is a very good document. And hey, if you've never bought a place, even if you're not looking to buy a place, it's easy. Just ring up, see a place for sale, ring up or send a message to the estate agent saying, can I have Section 32, please? And you get to read it. It's a great document. But what we did discover is, we were really attracted to the idea that there was a courtyard, front and back, all of that space. But here's the wonderful beauty of the housing system. And this is the Torrance system, which is actually really quite important. But how important, I don't know. The state government says the Torrance title system is critical to Victoria's property development and its prosperity. That's a big call, because basically it's a management system for kind of land information. But it is very kind of powerful. It's an Australian invention by Mr. Torrance, who's actually born in Ireland, where I was born, so that's good. But he came in South Australia in the 1850s. He was Treasurer of South Australia, and he introduced this system because of, and what it did was, and now it's replicated in many countries across the world. It does offer these kind of benefits, but does it offer fair and accurate information exchange? Well, when you get a Section 32 document, so I should have brought a printout, kind of cup I've had, it can be up to 30, 40 pages long. It's got a lot of information in it. And the person you're dealing with may not be a licensed real estate agent. They may be an agent's representative. In this case, I was dealing with this place with a licensed real estate agent who made it very clear that all the outside space was, all that space there, all the grey bits, yeah, that's all good, that's all yours. But of course it wasn't the case. The title, in lovely handwriting, because that's the way they used to do it, actually explains that the only thing on the title is actually the units and the actual units themselves, and the everything else is common property, and the car parks. So I guess the kind of point I want to make is, for a very reasonable price of just under $800, or even online for $595, 5-day course, you can be the representative to me of all this. Well, this is just one part of the complex information in terms of sale of property. And the kind of the driver for inaccuracy, ignorance, or bad faith, to me, is very strong within the system in terms of the real estate sector. When that's all you need to actually do the actual representation of the process. I mean, some people might agree with me, and some people might think I'm being terrible, kind of prejudiced against the real estate sector or whatever. But I've got plenty of other examples to kind of back it up. Okay, sorry we're running a bit late. That's all right, there's plenty to come back to. We'll take a short break, and we'll come back and we'll talk about mortgages, finance, banks, and policy capture. All right, so back at 6:24. All right, let's get back into it. Just 624. So what I've kind of put up here is what I found that was on the very last page of the contract, the mortgage contract that I recently signed mid-June for my first ever kind of home. So as I said, it's been a long time coming, so I'm being very interested in all the details. So I actually read the full contract and all the conditions. People have always advised you to do that, but we were paying a conveyancer to kind of make sure everything was kind of all right as well. But it's an interesting part of the system in terms of conveyancing system that they have all this interaction and all this information sharing with your mortgage provider. They don't actually look at the contract. You have to get that done separately. And, but hey, we trust banks, right? Okay. Let's come back to that. But I was interested in this wonderfully kind of clear language on the Appendix 1, interest rates new. There is no limit on a variable interest rate loan. There is no limit on the amount of interest which you may be liable. I mean, it sounds obvious, but it's kind of important. You might think, okay, it might go up a bit, but they're kind of saying, hey, it's a 30-year loan, could go up a lot. And there's other wonderful kind of language in it where it's basically saying no one can accurately forecast future rates. If you think it'll fall, maybe do this. If you think they will rise, maybe do this. Take advice. But actually nobody knows. So and I guess I thought it was a good way to kind of frame up this example of kind of making a decision about home ownership and the implications of that in relation to kind of finance. So, just going to go through a little exercise with some numbers. It's a year old. I would say this example I have directly stolen with Dr. Matt Palm's permission from last year, because he used it last year. So I'm just kind of, I've adapted it. So it's this time 2017 figures. So some of the variables will have changed. They haven't changed that much. Interest rates changed a bit. Markets tanked more. Well, it's kind of plateaued. So let's see. So we consider a couple who is moving from Melbourne to Sydney. They both work in the CBD and they want to settle in Footscray. Why would they want to settle in Footscray? Yeah. What else about Footscray? They work in the CBD. It's not too far away. Okay, you got this awful dockland area in the middle, but in between. But it's actually doesn't matter on the train. No, you get to see I don't know what you get to see. You get to see that temple. You get to see all those lovely high rises they're building.
Unless you're commuting in, which point it's a 20-minute drive.
Unless you're driving, yeah. And there may be delays because they're building a tunnel nobody asked for as well at the moment. Anyway, Footscray is our example. But they're moving down. So they've got an option. So to buy or rent. Now, on the face of it, they're paying kind of like, oh my good numbers, 70% more per week. Some of you can work out exactly the percentage, but a lot more per week to buy. So why would you buy? I think that's a really kind of important question. It's often kind of a counter argument that's made about kind of the progression or the dropping off of home ownership. On a policy level is an argument that said people are deciding to rent for longer. People like the flexibility of renting. They like the and they like the value they get from renting as against kind of home ownership and the lesser risk. Now, it's an interesting argument. It's very much a contentious argument, but it's kind of one worth kind of thinking about in terms of the kind of renting thing. And so we have, you know, and it's the idea that people are, you know, they rent and maybe they have investment properties because that's a better kind of thing to do, or they put their money elsewhere, though it's hard to kind of put your money anywhere these days to get any return on it, but, you know, somebody might convince them to put their money elsewhere and they think they'll get a better return. So, let's say they look seriously, no, we'll look seriously at buying. We've got a 20% deposit. All right, so, which is good. 20% deposit is good. Why is a 20% deposit good? No lender's mortgage insurance. That takes a little bit off the top in terms of what you're going to pay.
But at the same time, you're also potentially entering the market later, which mitigates any saving you would have made in lender's mortgage insurance.
That's something to consider as well. Anything else about a kind of 20% deposit that kind of can matter? There may be variability, not always, but there may be variability in terms of kind of the product that may be on offer. You've got 20% rather than 10%, 5%. I mean, it's a very much a moving thing at the moment, and we'll talk about the context of that in terms of what's available in the market. So there's always the offer of fixed or variable, and that's a key decision to make. So if this couple has made the decision to look at buying, then why are they making that decision? Are they making that decision because you're not really a grown-up unless you own your place?
Based on where they are in their life, if they've got kids that they need to relocate as well,
Yep.
they have to be within a certain school zone.
Yeah.
Well, not that buying would influence it, but I think there's been changes to how families declare their address to sit inside of zonings, because people have been doing dodgy things like renting houses that they don't live.
They have. But even so, not everybody can do that. Some people can do dodgy, but school zoning has been a kind of a driver of kind of prices in certainly certain areas of Melbourne. So if we move on from that to talk about why we do it, do people buy housing just because they got the deposit and the bank will give them the money to buy housing? It's a question. I'm not expecting you to answer that, but it's an important question. How much of this is a cultural driver? I need to be a homeowner. How much of it's a very pragmatic decision? I need security. I've had to move, 5 times in 10 years because I'm a renter. How much of it's about actually being in a specific location in relation to work, in relation to schooling, in relation to education, in relation to lifestyle, in relation to wanting to be connected to a community, or in relation to wanting to be connected to a particular community. I was talking to somebody recently who lives out in Craigieburn, and he was saying that there's basically a very significant community of people in his area from a particular part of India, and it's just been growing rapidly in the last number of years because they've got a temple, a Hindu temple, which they worship at. The temple's actually in a industrial unit. right on the edge of kind of Craigieburn. But it's actually a community, it's an important kind of community builder. There's the guy who runs it, can't remember what they call him, is it a Swami or something like that? There's something, you know, but the kind of the person who runs this particular originalist community is very well known. And that's actually it's also driving up prices because people from that particular background all want to live locally. So there are many reasons, many little reasons you might not see in the ABS stats or in the res plan stats or whatever as to what's happening with prices. If you look at Footscray, this is kind of last year's figures, you'd say it's not gone nuts, certainly not like Coburg. It's been steady. You see interesting things happening already up to 2017 with the apartment market. There's a lot of interesting things happening in Melbourne with the apartment market and pricing, and there's a lot to look into that. Certainly something to consider in terms of your assignments as well. Questions around the difference of what's happening with the kind of value of kind of houses on land and apartments in different areas. So with this example, there's a decision to be made. And is this decision around investment and capital growth? Is capital growth the main reason or a big driver for that when you're looking at the market? Because that's the dominant discourse. Growth in prices, growth in homes. Oh, yeah, get into that area because that's going, get in early, blah, 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 blah. But is that the only reason you would do that? And would that be a good choice? So then when we're looking at home interest rates, just to kind of get back to kind of basics on that, they are, in a way, centrally controlled. Even though they're delivered by kind of market operators, they're kind of the baseline for kind of interest rates is controlled through the central bank, which is a government entity, but it's an independent entity. It's and makes independent decisions. How independent? You're not just anybody if you're on the Reserve Bank board. So who picks those? Who knows? But they do operate independently. When the base rate goes up or down, then there is a response from the major financial institutions, and as you're probably aware, there's often a lot of hubbub about that, about whether it's passed on or not if it goes down. But and it has been going down. But there's a question of what we need to kind of look at here. It's just information about the RBA. They produce lots of reports. They've got lots of policy analysts and bods that kind of produce stuff and stats and charts and all of that. It's a great place to look for your assignments. Our couple making the decision about whether to buy or not are doing it based on, okay, we can get a fixed rate loan for 3.94%, kind of not bad. You probably get it for about a little bit lower than that now, a year later. You know what you're paying in your mortgage for that fixed time, and I could have put one of those charts there, but you know what they look like. You know what the total amount is you're going to pay over a 30-year mortgage. However, and this is a very simplified a simplified example where if the rate goes up, you may end up paying again 70% more in total for the home over time. Does that matter? Do people, when they get a mortgage, care how much they're going to pay have paid by 2035 or 2045 at this point? Because we're at 2019, 20. Do they care on the price of the amount they're paying for the money, for the credit. One thing to get into kind of the economics of it and concept of elasticity, which we're getting into a lot more next week, is that it depends who you are, how much the rate of home the home rate influences you. As it actually looks like kind of that there's a lot more impact on kind of first home buyers in different ways, and there's a lot of kind of reasons for that. Some of them may be down to the incentives that are available, but some of them may be down to things like, if you're a first home buyer, maybe your costs, potentially your actual costs to actually set up a home are a lot lower than if you're an existing home buyer and you're going to a new home. That tends to be actually a higher cost on that, because the overlap tends to be longer. You've got holding costs for financing, things like that. You may be kind of taking risk on waiting to kind of sell one before you buy the other and timing it that way, whatever. So there's so the cost, the actual dollar cost of the loan kind of may be a kind of stronger kind of driver in terms of making that decision. Whereas if you're a home buyer, you're more likely to go, that's okay, it's an extra $100 a month, I'm still want to get in and actually get in the market. So there's a lot to think about there in terms of the idea of kind of just getting a home loan, who's getting a home loan, and what are the actual reasons and decisions behind the decision to actually pay 70% more per week as against renting a property. Of course, people always say, well, you're throwing money away if you're renting. It's like, are you? You're actually buying a place to live. You're getting value. You're getting a product. So that kind of simplistic, are you throwing away money by renting, is, I think you need to kind of think about challenging that kind of simplicity when you think about, well, what is actually the value proposition? And also the idea, there's also a very prevalent idea, which is now Gavin Wood and RMIT's done quite a bit of work the last number of years looking at what's happened with the idea that once you're a homeowner, you're always a homeowner. You're in, and you're there. There's significant slippage out of home ownership back into rental, increasingly happening in the economy. It tends to happen from people from an age of about early 40s upwards. And there's a wide range of reasons for that, often to do with things like family breakup, things like changed circumstances, health issues or whatever, mean that the idea that home ownership is that safety net, pervasive safety net to the end of your life, is, the data doesn't necessarily support that for everybody. So that's the kind of decision to kind of deal with a bank, get a loan. What do we pay for it? Why would we do it? Where do we go? I want to talk a bit, when we're talking about governance and we're talking about the housing kind of system, some very kind of important information that's kind of come to light in recent times through the Financial Services Royal Commission. Now, you've probably heard there was tends to be called the Banking Royal Commission. You've probably heard of it. There's been quite a lot of kind of talk about it. But I thought I'd kind of I'll read this out for you. I won't do a posh Justice voice, but I'll read this out for you because I think this is the first thing that Justice Hayne, who was the Royal Commissioner, wanted to say in the report. It's a very long report, but this thing he wanted to say. First, in almost every case, the conduct in issue was driven not only by the relevant entity's pursuit of profit, but also by individuals' pursuit of gain, whether in the form of remuneration for the individual or profit for the individual's business. Providing service to customers was relegated to second place. Sales became all important. Those who dealt with customers became sellers, and the confusion of roles extended well beyond frontline service staff. Advisors became sellers, and sellers became advisors. It's not damning language. The evidence is damning, though, and the evidence of the whole report is damning. And part of his recommendation, this is the famous launch of the report with the Treasurer, Mr. Frydenberg, and Justice Hayne, where Justice Hayne famously refused to play media, and he just sat there like that, like not moving, for like 10 minutes, while the minister started to say, oh, well, it's not so bad, hey, you know, so it's important. And he was like, oh, read it, mate, it's bad. One of the key things that got uncovered, because there's a benign image about the banks and financial services and home loans and all of that Australia's like nice. Like, we didn't have what happened with the subprime crisis and the post-subprime crisis in America, where everybody got evicted and blah, blah, blah. And it's, you know, there's all these protections and there's all these, we haven't had these big eviction things, whatever. It's, you know, we're better here, we're nicer, we've got a higher value set or better regulation, whatever. Absolutely not true. Essentially what the Royal Commission says is that the banking system in relation to housing and a whole lot of other products is consistently doing wrong by the people it's meant to be kind of working for or working with, so as their customers. There's one kind of report that UBS did, which comes up with the concept of liar loans. Essentially, the idea that the loans offered are actually completely just not appropriate for the actual need of the person buying the property. And another really strong driver, and this is where the financial system and I think the real estate system kind of work in a tag team, is this drive to actually borrow more and borrow to the maximum that is available. And I don't think there's been a lot of work done on this yet. I could be standard corrected, but it begs the question about how much of that is a driver of kind of the inflation of kind of prices of property. When you have these, you've had within the financial services sector this inbuilt kind of push to kind of go, no, that's okay. No, you can go. We'll offer you. You can have 600,000, but you know, they want 650. You know, it's okay. It's okay. We can do that. And how much that's kind of driven inflation of properties.
So the comment that you made, advisors became sellers and sellers became advisors.
Yeah.
So I don't think it was damning language. I agree with you. I think it actually just fundamentally demonstrated the human condition of wanting to advance one's own agenda. Be you a bank or be you an individual human being. We're an organism that's driven to gaining. We just want to aggregate and have stuff because it's a protection. So I guess my argument around those pushing for 600 versus 650, I think that it's not, it doesn't seem like it's just so much as blaming the banks, but also blaming the cultural context. So if you actually look at what these buyers were purchasing with that extra 50k, it's probably a house that's more typical to what their parents had, because we're in that, because of information and all the information, or all the imagery that we're exposed to, it's influencing our decisions. So it's there. I'm not defending the banks. I hate banks. They definitely should be reclassed as usuries, but how does, like, putting the blame in one camp is just going to flex policy in one way? How do you get I won't say bipartisan, but like a sensible policy decision that doesn't just tackle one area and band-aid one area but expose another?
By having I guess that's a broad policy question of the idea of what is a good policy response in terms of, you know, whether there's siloed policies response, whether a federal response is supported by state action, et cetera, et cetera. It's a question around integration, and it's one that's, you'll see in the readings, you'll see every time you kind of look at housing policy, I guess the smarter people in housing policy, they are talking about, more than one lever. You know, it's actually dumb just to say, let's get rid of negative gearing and you won't believe what will happen, it'll be great. You know, no, it'll have some effect, but it's also, there are other kind of levers within government, whether they're fiscal levers, whether they're funding levers, whether they're planning policy levers, that also matter. But I guess the starting point's got to be evidencing what's actually been happening and what's actually going on, and looking at the implications of that. One thing I did, just in terms of the thing to remember about this Royal Commission is that initially both major parties and then the governments of the day absolutely resisted very, very hard the establishment of this Royal Commission. And it took quite a considerable kind of campaign, kind of that with, you know, a lot of kind of media kind of stories coming through, things like Get Up campaigns, et cetera, a lot of actually push from the kind of community to have this Royal Commission come through, because the government's view was, there's a few problems, but it's not that bad. And as we've discovered, you know, it is really, really bad in terms of the level of criminality. Was absolutely kind of outstanding in some areas. I mean, less sharply kind of focused on in that kind of housing kind of finance area, but certainly in the areas like things like products that the banks sell, like insurance products, etc., and the management of funds, pretty bad. One thing I'll just also mention is just looking at the impact on the marketplace for kind of finance of the Royal Commission. And actually the interim report of the Royal Commission, rather than the final report, had essentially the banks kind of, the major banks kind of responded in a very, by going into kind of risk management kind of mode, and actually taking some of the initial findings and so how it was being interpreted, because it was being kind of presented through the Royal Commission as being, this is actually very risky, you know, in terms of running a business here. You actually, how you're lending out the money, you're lending out too much money to the wrong people, you got a lot of risk here. The impact it's been pretty significant, and like a lot of things in this space, the data on it and how it's affected will take a few years to kind of come through. But I'll give you one example, back to my kind of recent kind of house purchase, or what ended up being flat purchase kind of journey. One thing I found from my very helpful, and actually, as far as I can see, not at all kind of evil at all, mortgage person in my bank, was actually very nice, but very helpful with information. And what he explained to me was, he said, where do you want to buy? And I mentioned kind of areas. And he came back and he kind of said there was a couple of particular areas of Melbourne, specifically Coburg, go back to Coburg again, where we were living and kind of wanted to look if we could buy in that area, where the bank was like, not actually giving loans on apartments to anybody unless they have 30% deposit. Like a blanket suburb, like we will not loan to that. And then a whole lot of other areas that were also basically blacklisted. And that kind of impact can have kind of serious impacts then on the production of housing. Because what it does is it actually really slows down. It slows down pre-sales on apartments, etc. So these kind of things were happening, and this is all as a result of the Royal Commission. Also a hardening up of all their kind of terms like the size of apartments, etc., what they're made of. And there's probably other things going on as well. Hard to kind of judge how much the cladding issue is having an impact on the production of housing. Probably quite significant because of the numbers involved, but it's actually hard to read that because of the different players involved. But certainly that's something where banks are looking at risk. So incomes, so basically it means people who 3 years ago could have got a loan quite easily based on their circumstances, and now they're getting rejected. A lot of people getting rejected. Who steps in? Other lenders called non-bank lenders. And they'll often step in outside of the regulatory system, outside of the kind of the regulatory system that to a certain extent offers protections, like tells you things like this in your contract, because you're kind of, it's consumer protection, and they go through kind of business loans. So people who are business owners get loans to their businesses to actually buy property. And there's one particular story that I kind of picked up that was totally kind of heartbreaking, where it's Mr. Anderson who kind of he took a loan, and the particular company, the non-bank lender, was very, very quick to basically call it in, and then to basically try to retrieve property from his apartment, and then actually in the second run to actually basically evict him from his apartment. And they had a lot more power to do this as non-bank lenders, to actually kind of execute the kind of their loss on their apparent loss on a business loan. But what happened was that the literally kind of goons working for the bank kind of broke into his apartment when he wasn't there, and his dog went missing. And his dog was found, and his dog was dead. It was found. So it's a horrible story. You may think, hopefully that doesn't happen all the time, but it's that kind of, if the housing market, if finance available in the housing market kind of moves outside of the protections that are there, even if they're, not always effective, it's possibly a very scary world for kind of consumers in terms of debt, because it's the equivalent of kind of payday lending for housing, and all that kind of goes with that. And that's a very sharp and kind of business which doesn't seem to have much time for kind of human rights or human decency. So certainly one to watch. And again, if you're thinking about your assignments, if you're really interested in finance, what's happening here? Are these new players? They've all got lovely names, by the way. They all sound lovely, and they advertise, and they sound cute, but not necessarily. So, the other thing I thought I'd talk about when we're talking about what's this got to do with policy capture? Well, for a start, just that earlier example, when we go back to Mr. Freudenberg, the Federal Treasurer, he said, yeah, we have to do changes. Obviously, it's wrong. You shouldn't have kind of these commissions. They have all these terrible effects. But you're going to need 3 years really to make the change. Yeah. And that's kind of one example, and kind of identified one example of, and it's been documented. You can look it up in the media. It's been well documented, the amount of effort that the lobbyists that work on behalf of the financial services system do in Canberra as a response to something like this. Very, very kind of, very, very strong. And often often the people who work for them are the mates of the politicians, because they're often ex-politicians or ex-senior public servants. All that thing is operating there. Just to note on some of the other drivers for this kind of policy capture, the idea that there's a policy capture, to go back to what you mentioned right back at the start, Sylvia, about why should these people kind of support something that goes against them. There's this sense that for the kind of major kind of political parties, we can't afford to piss off those people, homeowners, especially homeowners, older homeowners, and maybe homeowners with some investment properties. That's shooting ourselves in the foot. That's kind of, we'll get voted out next election, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that argument that a significant part of policy capture is the policy capture of a particular demographic in society that says, don't you touch mine. I worked hard for mine. Okay? I'm sorry that my kids and my grandkids have to work much harder to get less, but I still worked hard for mine and I want to keep mine. So they're an important player. But who are the other players? The Gurn and Phipps paper looks at New South Wales. All the states are different in terms of, I mentioned this last week, they've got different kind of flavours in terms of policy. But housing policy, there's a lot of consistencies. I mean, in how things operate. So I would wonder how much this statement, when they're made, where they're talking about, I'll read it out, you can't read it. Within the state of New South Wales, an unlikely alignment of developer and homeowner interests combined to limit new planning policy opportunities for affordable housing provision, closing the policy imagination to both inclusionary planning requirements and more direct funding measures for the new affordable housing supply. Other mechanisms of policy capture and political influence, including the revolving door between industry, lobby groups and politics, as well as the insidious forces of political corruption, which according to Anthony Albanese he's never seen, are also at play in the state of New South Wales. Something to think about in terms of, there's great ideas out there. I mean, there is more housing research done in Australia per capita than anywhere in the world. And there's so much reading you can do. Giving you one extract from an Ahuri paper this week. Do you know how much they produce? You can have a look. They're producing one every couple of weeks. They've all got huge amounts of information. This university is producing some new thinking on housing, not a lot. But RMIT and Swinburne and University of New South Wales, UTS, are all kind of producing huge amounts of information on kind of housing. There's lots of answers, there's lots of solutions. So, where's the energy for kind of change in the system? And without comment, I'll just leave up there a picture of the Minister for Planning and Housing, Richard Wynne MP, at a recent event with the UDIA. Now, Richard Wynne MP goes to other events with other stakeholders as well. But if you go onto the UDIA's website and see, because I got lots of pictures of this event, and see just how many people were there, like a lot of people. They all paid a chunk of money to kind of have lunch, listen to him talk. He would have come in for half an hour, gone off again. Sorry, I don't have time. I've got to leave, la la la. Place is absolutely packed full. Why? Why is a time with the minister kind of really important? And for somebody who kind of works in the local government area and kind of in an advocacy space, it's really hard to get access to him, you know, if you're in local government or if you're in a community housing provider. So You got to ask that question. What's the driver there, in terms of making decisions about policy and changes or not? I can't help but being political about everything to do with housing. Sorry, it's not. I'm just not going to give you technical information. I'll just leave you with this one chart, because I haven't used many charts, but it again, it goes to what you'll see a lot of commentary about, which is the level of household debt that's related to housing and housing debt in Australia. It's absolutely huge. It's Australia, again, is kind of a leading country in that regard. And what are the implications of that? I'm not giving you the answer to what the implications of that, because it's economics and there's lots of different factors and there's lots of different views. But what does it mean, though, that this huge level of debt that's been carried per household just to actually live in a home? Especially, what does that mean over time? What does that mean if people can't pay off their mortgage by the time they're 60, 65, 70 in the current environment, in terms of kind of, benefits being given? Yes.
Sorry, stupid question. What's Basel 1 mean?
All right, I'll talk. Basel is essentially the beginning. Basel is a kind of world, it's a bit like, the Paris Agreement for financial deregulation. So there's been similar further. There's been a Basel II agreement. I can't remember when it was, but these are they're key international agreements in relation to kind of finance that have been also key drivers in terms of things that we'll be talking about in a little bit of detail, like the idea of financialization, about the international movement of capital and the commodification of things like housing, taking them out of national, individualized kind of markets and into big kind of global kind of systems. I said I promised to finish 10 minutes early every week. Sorry, I'm finishing 9 minutes early, but I'm finished. Thank you very much. And Oscar, thank you. Don't clap, just go to your tubes. And go to your right tubes, please, because they're all nearly full, so it's going to cause a lot of problems. Please try to go to the one you're allocated to. Make it easier for everybody.
But this is academic right?
Yeah.
So you prefer to use the first
There's a particular thing. What I'll do, let me make a note of myself and I'll give it to the tutor. There is guidance from, it's not often used in, I guess, this field, in kind of planning and property and urban stuff in this field, but there is actually guidance on how you approach kind of writing personal and academic thing. And there's some guidance on the website. What I'll do is I'll share that with the tutors so they can talk it through at the tutorial. It can be done, and there's some guidance that's actually available on from the university about how to approach that. It might sound weird to kind of say, how can it be academic and that stuff, but there's a way to do it.
Okay. Okay.
Okay?
Another question you mentioned in the assignment brief. Our assignment is based on the nature of the housing market because I'm a property student. So my understanding the nature of the housing market means like the efficiency or like the transparency. So here for the urban planning, we need to base on the housing system. Like kind of this.
But it's part of the system. If you think about it, I guess you're thinking about efficiency of the system or transparency of information, all of that. They're also part of the system as well. So, yeah. And we'll talk about this. You'll find next week, I think you'll find very interesting because we'll really go into looking at that, both of the readings and what Terry Burke will be talking about next week. He'll be talking about the kind of, the idea of efficiency and economic efficiency and just all the kind of ways to kind of, different ways to kind of look at that and kind of look at and challenge maybe assumptions about it.
Okay.
So hopefully that will help next week.
Okay.
Okay.
I need to read the readings first.
Of course, always read the readings.
Yeah. So for the policy, it's also including like the property law or the planning law because I think it's relative to our legal assignments. Like you say the section 32 or the title.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, we can write something about that.
Absolutely. I just don't want to go too far into it. It is, it is an urban planning kind of subject.
Yeah,
And also, and there's a kind of, and I don't want to talk too far into stuff that I don't have expertise in, and I don't have expertise in property law. I'm trying to look at what is the kind of commonly used kind of tools which a well-informed person like a planner would kind of use. So I'm probably not going to go into as much detail as you would like, doing kind of property, because hopefully you've got other subjects that kind of really go into that detail. So, if I'm bored, I don't want to, there are so many different directions this course can go, and I want to make sure I don't want to be delivering kind of information beyond what I'm kind of confident to kind of do as well,
Yeah.
So, but I'm aware there's, quite a few, probably about 35% of the students are Masters of Property students.
Yeah.
So I'm aware of that.
Yeah, so I don't know, because we don't have the understanding of the urban planning, so I don't want to misunderstand this assignment. So just
talk about it in the tutorials. Bring your questions to the tutorials, because who's your tutor?
The lady, I
Marjan?
forgot his name. Yeah.
Marjan. Yeah. Bring the question on. Bring it tomorrow and say, okay, think about that, and she'll work it through, and she'll work it, and all the tutors will be feeding back to me and be discussing amongst ourselves the questions that come in to make sure that we're consistently then kind of advising, so everybody's kind of well set up to do the assignment.
Thank you.
Okay?
Thank you.
That's all right. Thank you.